The HR director didn't just fire me during the summer layoffs. She made sure everyone believed I deserved it. After 9 years of loyalty, my name was dragged through the company as if I were the problem. But while she was celebrating my exit, she had no idea I was sitting on evidence that could expose every lie she'd told. And when that evidence surfaced, her entire reputation started collapsing overnight. My name is Trenton, and for 9 years, I worked at a logistics technology company called Betrayal Dynamics in Charlotte, North Carolina. When I joined, we were barely keeping the lights on. The company occupied one floor of an aging office building. Our systems crashed constantly, and every quarter felt like a fight for survival. Most people didn't expect us to last another 2 years. I stayed anyway. Not because the pay was amazing. It wasn't. Not because management was perfect. They definitely weren't. I stayed because I believed in what we were building. Over the years, I watched the company grow from fewer than 50 employees to several hundred. New contracts came in. New offices opened. Revenue climbed. Every time we hit a major milestone, I felt proud knowing I'd played a small role in getting us there. I worked as a senior operations analyst. Most people outside the department probably couldn't explain exactly what I did, but when a major client had a problem, my team was usually the one cleaning it up. Long hours became normal. Late-night calls became routine. I missed birthdays, vacations, and more weekends than I can count. Like a lot of employees, I convinced myself loyalty would eventually be rewarded. For a long time, I genuinely believed it was. One of the people who seemed to appreciate my work most was our HR director, Marlowe. If you asked employees about her, most would describe her the same way: approachable, professional, supportive. She had a talent for making people feel heard. When someone was struggling, Marlowe always seemed to know exactly what to say. She remembered names, asked about families, and somehow managed to project warmth even during difficult conversations. At company events, executives loved putting her in front of a microphone. She represented the image Varela wanted employees to see: a company that cared, a company that listened, a company that treated people fairly. And honestly, for years, I bought into that image completely. Marlowe and I weren't friends outside work, but we'd worked together on enough projects that there was mutual trust. A few years earlier, I had volunteered for an employee retention task force designed to reduce turnover. Marlowe led the initiative. We spent months reviewing employee feedback, discussing workplace concerns, and creating recommendations for leadership. During those meetings, she often praised my contributions, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately. More than once, she told executives I was one of the company's most reliable employees. Those comments mattered, not because I needed compliments, but because they reinforced something I already believed: that hard work still counted for something. Then came the summer. Everything changed. Rumors started circulating in early June. A major contract had been lost. Budgets were tightening. Hiring freezes appeared almost overnight. People started whispering in hallways. Managers suddenly became harder to reach. Calendar invites appeared with vague titles. Nobody officially used the word layoffs, but everyone knew. The tension spread through the office like smoke. Every conversation seemed to end with the same question: have you heard anything? Most employees were nervous. Some were terrified. Oddly enough, I wasn't. Not at first. My performance reviews had always been strong. My projects were profitable. My department relied heavily on my experience. I had survived previous restructuring efforts without issue. If cuts happened, I figured I'd help manage the fallout. I never imagined I'd become part of it. Looking back now, there were warning signs. Small things, easy things to dismiss. Marlowe became noticeably distant. Meetings she'd normally invite me to suddenly happened without me. Questions I sent received delayed responses. A few conversations ended abruptly when I walked into rooms. At the time, I blamed stress. Everyone seemed stressed. The company was entering uncertain territory. Nobody was acting normally. So I ignored the feeling in my gut. The feeling that something had shifted. The feeling that people knew something I didn't. The feeling that the woman who had spent years telling employees she was their advocate had quietly started playing a very different game. And by the time I finally understood what was happening, it was already too late. The layoffs started on a Monday morning. Nobody announced them company-wide. There was no all-hands meeting, no warning, just a series of calendar invitations appearing on people's screens. 15 minutes. Private conference room. Mandatory attendance. By 10 o'clock, everyone knew exactly what those invitations meant. Employees disappeared into meeting rooms carrying laptops and coffee cups. Most returned looking stunned. Some came back crying. Others never returned at all. Their company accounts were disabled before they even reached the parking lot. The atmosphere inside Varela Dynamics changed by the hour. Conversations became whispers. People avoided eye contact. Managers locked themselves inside offices. Every notification sound made someone's stomach drop. Around noon, I noticed something strange. The names being discussed weren't the people anyone expected. One of the highest performing project managers was gone. A client success specialist who consistently exceeded targets was gone. A senior engineer with nearly 12 years at the company was gone. Meanwhile, several employees with weak performance records somehow remained untouched. The pattern didn't make sense. At first, I assumed leadership had access to information the rest of us didn't. There had to be some explanation. There always was. Then my calendar notification appeared. Private meeting. Human resources. 15 minutes. Conference room 4B. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Something felt wrong immediately. Not nervous. Wrong. The kind of feeling you get right before bad news arrives. I tried convincing myself it could be related to restructuring plans, department changes, resource planning, anything else. Deep down, I already knew better. The walk to the conference room felt longer than usual. Every hallway seemed unusually quiet. Every face looked tense. When I opened the door, Marlowe Voss was already sitting inside. A termination packet rested neatly on the table. Next to it sat a representative from legal. That was all I needed to see. 9 years. Reduced to a folder. "Please have a seat, Trenton," Marlowe said. Her voice sounded calm, almost rehearsed. I sat down slowly. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then she began reading from prepared notes. "Due to organizational restructuring and operational adjustments, your position has been eliminated." There it was. Just like that. 9 years gone. No discussion. No warning. No opportunity to respond. Only a script. I expected disappointment. Maybe frustration. What I didn't expect was what came next. Marlowe started referencing concerns about my recent performance. My recent performance. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. She mentioned communication issues, project inconsistencies, questions regarding leadership effectiveness. Each statement hit me harder than the last, because none of it was true. Not only was it untrue, it directly contradicted years of documented evaluations. I interrupted her. "I'm sorry, what performance concerns?" Marlowe glanced down at her paperwork. "There were multiple factors involved in the decision." "That's not what you said." The room became very quiet. For the first time, she looked slightly uncomfortable. Only slightly. Then the corporate language returned. "These decisions are complex and involve numerous considerations." That wasn't an answer. And she knew it. I could feel something changing inside me. The shock was fading. Questions were replacing it. I had received strong reviews only months earlier. My department head had praised my work repeatedly. Several major clients specifically requested my involvement on projects. Nothing about this made sense. Yet Marlowe continued reading from her packet as though she were discussing weather forecasts. When the meeting ended, she offered the usual corporate sympathy. "We appreciate your years of service." I looked directly at her. For 9 years, I'd believed she was one of the few people in leadership who genuinely cared about employees. Now I couldn't tell whether she'd been lying today, or for the last decade. I left the building carrying a cardboard box and a growing sense that something wasn't right. The drive home was a blur. My phone remained silent for nearly an hour. Then messages started arriving. Former coworkers. recently terminated employees, people comparing stories. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Several had received nearly identical explanations. Several had been told they suddenly had performance concerns. Several had spotless records. The more conversations I had, the stranger everything became. Then, later that evening, my phone rang. It was a former colleague named Brenner Cade. His voice sounded nervous. "There's something you need to see." "What is it?" A pause. Then another. Finally he spoke. "Someone accidentally copied me on an internal review document a few months ago." I sat upright. "What kind of document?" "It listed employees considered future workforce risks." The room suddenly felt smaller. My heartbeat accelerated. "Why are you telling me this now?" Another pause. "Because he already knew the answer. Because I already knew the answer." Then he said the words that changed everything. "Trenton, your name was on that list. Months before the layoffs ever happened. Months before restructuring was announced. Months before Marlowe sat across from me and pretended this was simply business." And at that moment, I realized something terrifying. I hadn't been caught in a layoff. I had been selected for one. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same conference room, the same termination packet, the same expression on Marlowe's face. Not guilt, not regret, control. As if the outcome had been decided long before I ever walked through that door. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself sitting alone in my kitchen, staring at a cold cup of coffee. My laptop sat open in front of me. Unread messages continued arriving from former coworkers. Most were supportive. A few were angry. Some were scared they might be next. But one question kept replaying inside my head. Why me? If layoffs were truly based on restructuring, why had my name appeared on a workforce risk list months earlier? Why had strong performers been removed while weaker employees remained? And why had Marlowe suddenly started talking about performance concerns that had never existed? The pieces didn't fit together. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. For nearly a decade, I had done everything the company asked, worked late, solved emergencies, protected client relationships, mentored new hires. Yet somehow, I was being portrayed as a problem employee. The accusation bothered me more than losing the job itself, because a job can be replaced. A reputation is harder to rebuild. The following week felt strange. For the first time in years, I woke up without somewhere to be. No meetings, no deadlines, no overflowing inbox, just silence. And that silence gave me too much time to think. I started replaying old conversations, old meetings, old decisions, looking for something I had missed. At first, I found nothing. Then I remembered the Employee Retention Task Force. Years earlier, Marlowe had asked me to help organize feedback reports and workforce surveys. Most of the files had been archived after the project ended. I wasn't even sure I still had them. But one afternoon, while cleaning out old folders on a backup drive, I found a directory I hadn't opened in years. Thousands of old emails, draft reports, meeting notes, survey summaries. Most of it was harmless, routine corporate paperwork. The kind of documents nobody ever reads twice. Still, I kept digging. Partly because I was curious, partly because something in my gut refused to let this go. Hours passed, then an entire day. The deeper I searched, the more details started resurfacing. Names, meetings, internal discussions I'd completely forgotten about. And then I found something unusual. A chain of emails marked confidential. The subject line caught my attention immediately. It referenced employee retention metrics and workforce planning recommendations. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Then I noticed several attachments were missing from the final reports that had been presented to employees. That was odd, very odd. I opened every message carefully, comparing drafts, comparing revisions, comparing who received what information. The differences weren't dramatic, not at first, but there was a pattern. Certain employee concerns appeared in early versions and disappeared later. Negative feedback about leadership vanished. Recommendations from staff were quietly removed. Entire sections had been rewritten before reaching wider audiences. The changes always seemed to benefit management, and one name kept appearing throughout the revisions: Marlowe Voss. I leaned back in my chair. My frustration slowly transformed into something else. Suspicion. Because these weren't simple formatting edits. Someone had been shaping narratives, controlling what information moved upward, controlling what information disappeared. Then I opened another attachment. This one hit differently. It referenced discussions surrounding retention risks, employee classifications, and future staffing strategies. Buried inside were comments about protecting executive incentive structures during future workforce reductions. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. My pulse quickened. If I was understanding it correctly, certain staffing decisions weren't being driven entirely by operational needs. Financial incentives were part of the equation. Maybe a large part. Suddenly, the layoff felt bigger than my personal situation. Much bigger. I wasn't looking at a random termination anymore. I was looking at the first loose thread in something far more complicated. And for the first time since losing my job, I stopped asking why it happened. Instead, I started asking a different question. How much had they been hiding? The moment I started uncovering those old emails, I made a decision. I wasn't going to act out of anger. That would be exactly what people expected. A bitter former employee, a disgruntled layoff victim, someone looking for revenge because he couldn't accept losing his job. If I went public without proof, everything I said could be dismissed. So I treated the situation the same way I treated operational failures during my years at Varela. I followed the evidence. Nothing else. For the next 2 weeks, my apartment looked less like a home and more like an investigation room. Folders covered my dining table. Notes filled multiple legal pads. Timelines stretched across an entire whiteboard I bought specifically for the project. Every document led to another question. Every question led to another document. And the deeper I dug, the more uncomfortable the picture became. The workforce risk list Brenner had mentioned wasn't an isolated document. I found references to similar classifications buried throughout older communications. Different names. Different departments. Same pattern. Employees identified as future concerns often experienced the same sequence of events. First, they were quietly excluded from development opportunities. Then promotions disappeared. Then visibility with senior leadership decreased. Finally, when restructuring occurred, they became easy targets. At first, I considered the possibility that I was seeing patterns that weren't really there. Confirmation bias. People see what they want to see all the time. So I started testing my own assumptions. Whenever I found evidence supporting my theory, I actively searched for evidence that contradicted it. Instead of weakening my conclusions, it made them stronger. The pattern kept surviving scrutiny, again and again. One afternoon, I received a call from a former supervisor named Callan Mercer. We hadn't spoken since my termination. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, he lowered his voice. "I heard you've been asking questions." I laughed. Apparently, word travels fast. It always does. There was a pause. Then he said something unexpected. "You weren't the only one who thought the layoff decisions were strange." That got my attention. Callan explained that several department leaders had submitted workforce recommendations before the layoffs. Yet some final decisions didn't align with what managers originally proposed. Certain names appeared on termination lists, despite strong internal support. Other names remained protected, despite ongoing performance concerns. The discrepancies had frustrated multiple supervisors. At the time, most assumed leadership had additional information. Now they weren't so sure. When the call ended, I updated my timeline. Another piece fit into place, but I still lacked something critical. Intent. Patterns mattered, documentation mattered. Yet proving manipulation required more than circumstantial evidence. A few days later, an unexpected opportunity arrived. Through a former coworker, I was introduced to Dorian Pike, a retired compliance specialist who had spent years reviewing corporate governance cases. I didn't tell him what conclusion I wanted. I simply showed him the documents, the timelines, the communications, the workforce risk classifications, everything. For nearly an hour, he reviewed the materials silently, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking questions. Finally, he pushed the folder aside. His expression had changed. "What do you think?" I asked. Dorian looked directly at me. I think you're asking the wrong question. That wasn't the answer I expected. What question should I be asking? He tapped a document with his finger. You're trying to determine whether people were targeted. I nodded. That's obvious. His next words stopped me cold. The bigger question is who benefited? The room became very quiet, because suddenly the entire situation looked different. If certain employees were being removed systematically, if information was being filtered before reaching executives, if workforce decisions consistently favored specific groups, then someone wasn't merely managing layoffs. Someone was managing outcomes. And the more records I examined through that lens, the more one name kept appearing at the center of everything. Marlowe Voss, the trusted HR director, the advocate, the problem solver, the person employees turned to when they needed protection. Meanwhile, another disturbing pattern was emerging. People who challenged HR recommendations, people who questioned internal policies, people who pushed back against management narratives. They seemed to appear disproportionately on workforce risk lists. Not always, but often enough to notice, including me. Because years earlier, during retention meetings, I'd repeatedly challenged several reporting practices. At the time, I thought those debates were professional disagreements. Now I wasn't so sure. And then I found the document that changed everything. A document that transformed suspicion into something far more dangerous. A document that suggested my termination may have had nothing to do with summer layoffs at all. The document wasn't even supposed to be in my hands. It was an internal executive summary. Restricted access, no distribution outside senior leadership. Yet somehow, a partially redacted version had been archived in an old compliance backup system I'd gained access to through a forgotten project folder. At first, it looked like another routine workforce analysis. But then I saw the section header, Risk Containment Through Strategic Separation Events. My stomach tightened. I read slower, carefully, line by line. The document wasn't talking about layoffs as cost-cutting measures. It described them as stability tools, mechanisms used to minimize internal disruption from organizational dissent. That phrase hit me harder than anything before it, because it reframed everything. This wasn't just about performance. It wasn't even just about restructuring. It was about removing specific employees who created friction inside the system. People who asked questions. People who challenged decisions. People who didn't quietly accept everything they were told. I kept reading. There were examples, not names but identifiers. And the identifiers matched patterns I already recognized. High-performing employees with unusually low leadership alignment scores. Workers flagged for communication disruption tendencies. Teams marked as policy friction contributors. It wasn't random. It was structured, intentional, systematic. Then I reached the section that made my hands go cold. A breakdown of how decisions were presented to executive leadership. It stated that HR summaries were pre-filtered to align with strategic messaging priorities. In simpler terms, executives weren't always seeing the full picture. They were seeing curated versions of it. My mind immediately went back to Marlowe Voss. The meetings, the polished reports, the calm explanations, the way she always spoke with absolute certainty. Then I saw another line buried near the bottom, a reference to a primary HR coordination authority responsible for narrative consolidation across workforce events. There was no full name, just a roll code. But I didn't need a name. I already knew who it pointed to. Marlowe. And then everything snapped into place in a way I didn't expect. I wasn't just reading about layoffs. I was reading about influence, control over information, control over perception, control over who gets labeled as necessary and who gets quietly removed. But the final piece wasn't about the system. It was about me. There was a subsection labeled Preemptive Risk Removal Cases. I scanned it quickly at first, then slowly reread it. My name wasn't written directly, but the identifiers matched my profile exactly. Tenure, 8+ years. Role, operations critical. Behavioral note, frequent policy challenge participation in retention forums. Status update, escalation risk prior to Q3 restructuring. Then a timestamp. It was dated months before the summer layoffs were ever announced. My breath felt heavier, because this meant something far more disturbing than anything I had assumed. I wasn't removed because I was expendable. I was removed because I was becoming inconvenient. And the timing of it, that's what confirmed everything. I had been marked long before any financial crisis, long before restructuring, long before the layoffs were publicly justified. My termination wasn't a reaction to business conditions. It was a pre-planned decision, executed during a convenient moment. And the person who had finalized that classification? The same name kept appearing in the document's approval chain. Marlowe Voss. Suddenly, her calm voice in that conference room replayed in my mind. Due to organizational restructuring, a rehearsed sentence covering something far more deliberate. I sat there for a long time without moving. Not angry anymore. Not confused. Just clear. Because now I understood the real structure beneath everything. The layoffs weren't random. They weren't even purely financial. They were selective. And I wasn't a casualty of the process. I was a target inside it. That realization changed everything about what I was going to do next. Because once you understand you were never meant to survive the system, you stop trying to appeal to it and start thinking about how to expose it. I didn't sleep after that. Not because I was angry, but because for the first time, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't just workplace politics anymore. This was controlled narrative abuse inside a corporate system. And if I handled it wrong, it would disappear like it never existed. So I stopped thinking like an employee and started thinking like someone building a case that had to survive scrutiny. The next morning, I didn't post anything. I didn't send angry emails. I didn't message former coworkers asking them to speak up. Instead, I started organizing everything into one clean, undeniable record. Timelines, original documents, revised summaries, email chains, workforce classifications. Every version of every truth I could prove. I labeled each file carefully. No emotion in the naming, just structure, just evidence. Then I reached out to someone I trusted from my old compliance contacts and requested guidance on formal reporting channels outside the company's internal hierarchy. What I learned confirmed something important. If I went public randomly, it would be dismissed as emotional retaliation. But if I submitted through structured compliance escalation channels, with verified documentation and cross-referenced records, it couldn't be ignored as easily. So I chose the harder path, the slower one, the one that required patience. I submitted everything through an independent external review pathway tied to corporate governance oversight. Then I waited. The first response came 2 days later, a formal acknowledgement. Then another. Then requests for clarification. Within a week, something shifted inside Varela Dynamics. I didn't see it directly at first, but I heard about it through former coworkers. Sudden executive meetings, emergency internal reviews, legal teams being pulled into HR discussions. And then the real reaction started. Employees were quietly contacted for follow-up interviews. Some were asked to provide copies of old performance reviews. Others were questioned about how layoff decisions had been communicated. And for the first time, people inside the company started comparing notes openly. The inconsistencies were no longer hidden. They were being discussed. That's when Marlowe Voss reappeared in the story. Not publicly, not in statements, but in internal tension. According to someone still inside HR, she had started reviewing documentation personally, rechecking files, revalidating decisions. But the problem was already out of her control. Because once external review bodies start asking for raw data, curated summaries stop being enough. They want originals, full versions, unedited chains. And those didn't always match what had been presented upward. A former manager, Callan Mercer, called me again during this period. His voice was different this time, less uncertain, more alert. "They're struggling to align the records," he said. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means what we suspected isn't holding up under review." A pause. Then he added something that stayed with me. "Some of the layoff justifications don't trace back to actual operational data anymore." That was the fracture point. Because once justification breaks, intent becomes visible. And when intent becomes visible, accountability follows. Then came the moment everything escalated. An official external inquiry notice was issued to Varela Dynamics. Not public yet, but serious enough that senior leadership was required to preserve all HR decision records related to the summer layoffs. Within days, the atmosphere inside the company collapsed into controlled panic. People stopped speculating. They started preparing. And Marlowe Voss, the woman who had once delivered layoffs with calm certainty, was suddenly at the center of an investigation she could no longer narrate her way out of. Then I received one final message. Not from HR, not from lawyers, from an anonymous internal source. A screenshot of a conversation inside a leadership channel. One line stood out. We need to reassess how Trenton Hale's termination was classified before external review escalates further. I stared at that sentence for a long time, because that was the moment I realized something important. They weren't just reacting to my leak. They were reacting to the possibility that everything I had was real. And that meant the system wasn't defending itself anymore. It was trying to contain the damage. But it was already too late for that. The investigation didn't explode overnight, but it unraveled the company piece by piece. Quietly at first, then publicly enough that it couldn't be controlled anymore. Executives who had once dismissed concerns were now forced into formal reviews. External auditors requested full access to original HR decision trails. And for the first time in years, people inside Varela Dynamics were being asked a question they weren't used to answering. Who actually approved this? The summer layoffs, once framed as routine restructuring, were no longer simple. They were under scrutiny from multiple angles. And the more layers were peeled back, the more uncomfortable the truth became. Several termination decisions didn't match the original departmental recommendations. In multiple cases, managers had documented strong performance records that never appeared in final HR summaries. And in a few instances, employees flagged for risk had no supporting operational data at all. The inconsistencies were too structured to ignore. Inside HR, pressure intensified. Reports later, leaked through former colleagues, described emergency internal reviews, overwritten documentation requests, and tense meetings that lasted late into the night. And at the center of it all was Marlowe Voss, the same person who had once stood in front of employees speaking about fairness, transparency, and care. Now she was being asked to explain gaps in documentation that she couldn't fully reconcile. I never saw those meetings. I didn't need to. The results started showing up elsewhere. Employees who had been terminated during the layoffs began receiving formal reevaluation notices. Some were offered reinstatement discussions. Others received compensation adjustments. Not because anyone admitted wrongdoing publicly, but because the internal structure could no longer support the original narrative. And then, unexpectedly, I received a formal confirmation. My termination classification was under review. Not reversed, not confirmed. Just reviewed. But that alone said enough. It meant the system was no longer confident in its own decision. For me, the personal outcome came weeks later. I didn't go back to Varela Dynamics. I didn't want to. Even if they had offered reinstatement, something fundamental had already shifted. Trust doesn't reset just because paperwork changes. Instead, I accepted a position at a smaller operations consultancy firm that actually valued transparency in decision-making. Different environment, different energy. No hidden narratives behind closed doors. One afternoon, months after everything settled, I sat alone in my new office looking out over a quiet street. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't replaying old conversations or questioning past decisions. But I still thought about one thing. Not revenge, not victory, understanding. Because what I learned through all of this wasn't just about one HR director or one company. It was about how easily systems can shift when information is controlled by a small group of people. How decisions can look fair on paper while being completely different underneath. And how quickly trust can be rewritten into something unrecognizable. People often think betrayal is loud. But in corporate environments, it's usually quiet. Signed in meetings, hidden in summaries, buried in final versions of documents no one questions. Before everything ended, I thought I lost my job because of restructuring. Now I understand something more accurate. I lost it because I stopped fitting into a version of the company someone else was trying to build, and exposing that version came with consequences. Not just for them, but for everyone who believed it without question. If there's one thing this entire experience taught me, it's that most people don't see betrayal when it's happening. They only recognize it when it's already been justified, wrapped in corporate language, signed off in meetings, filed under necessary decisions. I used to believe loyalty mattered. 9 years of consistent work, late nights, and solving problems under pressure. I thought that meant something permanent. But companies don't always measure value the way employees think they do. Sometimes, value is just what fits the current narrative, and anything outside that narrative becomes a risk. What happened with Marlowe Voss wasn't just about one HR director making bad choices. It was about how easily information can be shaped before it ever reaches the people who are supposed to make fair decisions, and how dangerous it becomes when no one questions the version they're given. I don't tell this story to sound bitter. I tell it because I've seen how quickly people assume systems are always neutral. They're not. They're built by people. And people have incentives, biases, agendas. Most employees never see behind that layer. They only see the final message: restructuring, realignment, performance concerns, clean words for messy realities. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Don't assume silence means safety. Don't assume documentation always reflects truth. And don't assume authority always means fairness. Because sometimes the most dangerous decisions aren't made in chaos. They're made calmly, professionally, and with complete confidence that no one will ever question them. My name is Trenton, and I learned the hard way that in corporate systems, truth doesn't always win by being true. It wins when someone finally has enough proof to make it undeniable.